Started.
Okay, does that mean we're good to go then, Karen? Good, I will take that as a yes. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this first virtual Audit Committee meeting. May I remind everyone, first of all, that the meeting will be recorded via the internet. It's not being broadcast live, but it will be available for future viewing on the Council's archive system, so please be aware of that. Obviously, unlike being in person, things are going to be a little different, so a bit of housekeeping before we start then. Members, if you could please mute yourselves when you're not speaking. That's just to reduce the chance of background echo, etc. If anyone does wish to speak, please put your hand up. If you use that function, we will then make a note of that. We will make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak on each item as and when they wish to. If you have any difficulties hearing or being heard throughout the procedures, please let either me or Amy or Karen know, and we will do our best to sort those issues out. And we will obviously have to do that as we go along. And before we begin the meeting formally, if we go through and introduce everybody so that for anyone watching, they know exactly who we all are. I will start then. I'm Councillor George Carroll, Chairman of the Audit Committee and elected member for the Landdoc Board. And I will hand over to my Vice Chair, Councillor Leighton Rowlands.
Hi, I'm Councillor Leighton Rowlands. I'm the Vice Chair of the Audit Committee and I'm Councillor for Devon Ward in Barry.
Okay, Councillor Ian Johnson.
Councillor Ian Johnson, member for Buttrell's Ward in Barry.
Councillor Pam Drake.
I'm Councillor Pamela Drake. I represent the Castle and Ward in Barry.
Councillor Jane Norman. Jane, could you unmute yourself, please? There should be an icon under the attendees list. It's sort of next to under the audio option. There are three options: computer, audio, phone call, no audio, and there's a button next to that. If you press that, I think that should get you working again.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'm Councillor Jane Norman. I'm a member for Landshut Major.
Fantastic. Councillor Catherine McCaffer.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Councillor Catherine McCaffer, Plymouth Ward member.
Okay, Paul Lewis.
Yes, good evening. I'm Paul Lewis. I'm the lay member on the Audit Committee for the Vale of Glamorgan Council.
Okay, Amy Rudman.
Good afternoon all, my name's Amy Rudman. I'm the Democratic Services Officer supporting the committee today.
Thanks, Amy. Gemma Jones.
Good afternoon all, my name's Gemma Jones and I'm Principal Accountant.
Chair, I'm not sure, did you miss Councillor Wilson?
I am dreadfully sorry, Mark. I thought we were one down. For some reason, you're not on my screen. Councillor Mark Wilson.
Well, actually, you're almost, you're just below me. You're on the screen. All right.
Ah, thanks. Apologies for that.
I'm Councillor Mark Wilson for Stanwell World, Chair of Corporate Resources and ex-Chair for the Audit Committee.
Just to double check, Karen, that is all the elected members now, isn't it?
Yes, Chair. Yeah. Yes, that's fine.
Apologies, Mark.
That's all right, no worries.
Joan Davis.
Hello, my name's Joan Davis and I'm the Audit Client Manager.
Mark Thomas.
Good evening all. Mark Thomas, Head of the Regional Internal Audit Service.
Steve Wyndham.
Hello, thank you, Chair. Hello, all. I'm Steve Wyndham from Audit Wales. We're the external auditors of the Vale Council. Yeah, That's it.
Carolyn Michael.
Thank you, Chair. It's Carolyn Michael. I'm the Operational Manager for Accountancy in the Vale of Glamorgan.
Harris Lord.
Your mute button's not working, Caris. We've got an issue there.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. We can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm Caris Lord. I'm the Head of Finance in the Vale of Glamorgan Council.
Okay, Rachel Freitag.
Hi, I'm Rachel Freitag. I'm the Audit Lead from Audit Wales on the External Audit.
And finally, I think, but correct me if I'm wrong, Karen Bowen.
Yes, Chair, I'm here, Karen Bowen, Democratic Services Officer. I'm just going to be supporting in the background. Amy Redman is going to be the Democratic Services Officer supporting the meeting and taking the notes of the meeting. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I think that was everyone, but if there was anybody I missed, can you please correct me now on that? I will take that silence as a no. So if we begin with the meeting proper then, with the first item on the agenda, apologies for absence. We're all here, so that's no apologies. And to item 2, the minutes of the last meeting, which seems like a lifetime ago now. 1 or 2 things have happened since then, held on the 3rd of February. Do we have any comments on the minutes? If not, can we have someone to propose and second them, please?
I'm happy to propose them.
I'm happy to second.
Fantastic. We'll take those as read then. And item 3, to receive declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Okay, I will take that as a no, and on to item 4, which is the annual governance statement 2019-20.
Okay, I think I'm taking that one, Chair, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine, Caris.
So what you have in front of you today is the draft annual governance statement. The Council is required to undertake a review of the controls in place to manage the risks and to outline any improvements that need to be made. This is reported on an annual basis as part of the Statement of Accounts process. So the draft annual governance statement for 2019-20 is attached as Appendix A to the report that you've had for tonight's meeting. The document actually remains live now until the accounts for 2019-20 are closed. Therefore, it will not be signed off until later on in the year. As such, the document can be updated if issues arise between now and the time the statement of accounts are actually closed that we feel needs to be reported via that process. As the document remains a live document, we have actually referenced COVID-19 in the document, as you'll have seen. Whilst the impact of this for 2019-20 was obviously limited, it is obviously going to impact on the Council through the current financial year, and therefore I believe it's properly referenced in the annual governance statement. That the statement reaches the conclusion that overall there's a reasonable assurance on the Council's internal control environment, and that's been based on the work that internal audit have done, but also on other work that's done through the Council, and again that's detailed in the report for you. What our Audit Committee are asked to do tonight is to consider the draft annual government statement, to let us have any comments you may have on it, and then to recommend it to both the leader and the MD for approval. I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know whether Mark wants to add anything at this point.
Thank you, Caris. Yeah, just to say that we coordinate the production of the statement on behalf of the authority, but it's very much dependent on the information that we receive from a range of colleagues across the authority. So it is very much a joint effort, but myself and Joan put the document together, as I say, with a lot of input from a range of colleagues, including Carolyn, for example, particularly updating the finance information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Caris. I think I'm right in saying your presentation is complete. Brilliant. Okay, then if we move on to questions and comments from members.
Chairman,
Okay,
I believe Councillor Johnson and Councillor Wilson have indicated in the chat that they'd like to make a statement, please.
Thank you. Amy, if we begin with Councillor Johnson and then on to Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much to Caris, Mark and everybody involved in this. It's a very thorough document, as we've come to expect. So a couple of brief comments. The first one is regarding the process for, obviously with the changing situation regarding COVID-19, just a process for whether we will see any alterations to this draft as it goes through. Will it come back to us, or does our ratification tonight imply, or recommendation tonight imply that's the last that we'll see of it? And then the two other just quick points. Page 12 of the of Appendix A, in particular, I just want to flag up, because it's something we flagged last year. It's the area around public understanding of council financial situations. I find that it's as the context of council financial situation changes, I'm not sure this is an appropriate thing for us to be commenting upon within this document. The interpretation of the council's financial challenge is different depending on who you wish to speak to, and suggesting that what essentially is a communication issue, the council says sometimes that it's in a difficult situation and doesn't understand why people don't agree with it, is a difficult position, and I don't think that's necessarily appropriate within the documents. And then just a quick point on page 26, which is regarding the number of corporate complaints which are met within the timescale. Obviously, it's appropriate to be noted within here. I'd just like to flag up my concern that a third of our complaints are not met within the corporate timescale. So is to summarise those points, what's the process to go forward from here after we make a recommendation tonight? As I hope that we will. It's a very thorough document. I am concerned about the use of public perception data. I'm not sure the appropriateness of that within this governance document, and also just where are we planning on receiving greater information or resolution regarding those corporate complaints, because a third of complaints not being on time troubles me. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Johnson. If I hand over to Caris then.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Firstly, in relation to what happens to the statement from here, just to confirm that it does come back to Audit Committee in a final form and an updated form if it has been updated in the intervening period. When the final statement of accounts come for approval from Audit Committee, it comes as part of that report. So Audit Committee will have the opportunity to see this again, and we will highlight at that point any changes that have been made between now and the time in which you get the final copy. In relation to the public understanding of our financial situation, I suppose what we're really reporting in here is the outcome of the consultation exercise that we did. It is an ongoing issue for us to ensure that people in the Vale do understand the financial situation. I do appreciate what you're saying about the text that we've got in here. If you've got any suggestions really with regards to how you think that might be better presented, then we'd be happy to have a look at them really. I suppose what we're trying to get over is that we are doing work to try and get the people in the Vale to understand our financial situation better. In relation to the complaints and your comment around only about a third of them not being answered within corporate timescales, we do have the opportunity, obviously, when we're dealing with a complaint, to negotiate with the individual who's raised the complaint should we need to extend the timelines, particularly if it's a complex complaint. but it is within the terms of reference of the Audit Committee to consider the complaints procedure and complaints that we receive. So we do bring an annual report through to Audit Committee, which will give you more detail really with regards to numbers that we've had, numbers have met the timelines, numbers that have been exceeded, and any lessons learnt that we've had from complaints. So there will be a report coming through to Audit Committee and a lot more detail on complaints during the coming year. Does that help? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Carys. If I now move on to Steve wanted to come in there, I think.
Yes, please. Thank you, Chair. It's just to add really to Councillor Johnson's question about could there be potential changes. It's just to clarify really, the AGS is encapsulated as in part of our audit review. We will be looking at the AGS and the key things we are looking for are compliance with the requirements. You know, there are requirements in terms of the types of things that should be communicated in the AGS. And the second aspect is also in regard to is it aligned with our expectations and our knowledge of the council? So in a sense, is it factually accurate? So there is a chance then of potential changes being made to the AGS. I just want to sort of clarify that really, so members are fully aware of the process we're going through here.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. If we move on to Councillor Mark Wilson.
All right, thank you, Chair. And can I also thank the officers for working so hard on our annual governance statement, especially given the situation that we are facing. And I'm sure the Chair would echo that in that, because the amount of effort being made at the moment is amazing, considering the issues that we are all facing at the moment. Just on observations, really, can I also note that the number of complaints dealt with earlier on and actually closed was very, very high. And I was very, very pleased with that. And I think that's a good indictment on the council that we are taking complaints seriously when being dealt with. I also think it's very good, though, that we try and resolve these complaints informally as much as we can before they get formal, because they do take an awful lot of time. And if they are not that serious, then clearly we need to be thinking about how we can perhaps fast track them to effective closure. So I do think that is an issue. I think one of the things I would like to see going forward, though, perhaps is maybe some sort of preface on the annual governance statement, is like, you know, like maybe a page or half a page, just to say what the governance statement is really about, what's it for, why we need to do it, and even perhaps maybe something from the auditors as to say the terms of reference for it as well, because I think that would be useful so that people could understand the context of it. Thank you.
Okay, I've got some of you want to come back on that, Carys.
Well, certainly we're happy to look at the annual governance statement. It is supposed to be accessible so that people can pick it up and read it. So I do agree that maybe a short preface at the front of it, just outlining what it is, why we do it, and how we deal with it would probably be a benefit for next year.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have any other questions or comments from members? I will take that as a no. If we move on to our recommendations, then obviously the first the recommendation in the report is to recommend the annual governance statement for adoption. But in light of what Councillor Johnson said, particularly with regard to the public understanding of the financial situation, perhaps we could propose a separate recommendation on that front, that Cabinet review this section of the report, perhaps to ensure that it's better worded. Councillor Johnson?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think that the situation we're in is that there's an opportunity, if Carys could correct me on this, but that there is an opportunity to revise, and this final version will come back to us in the next meeting. So I mean, I'm happy for this to be agreed as it stands, and if there's any, Carys I think has generously suggested that if there's any alternative wording or something that might be usable, and that simply is reported to us in a few months' time when it comes back. I don't see there's a need for anything else beyond that.
Okay, as long as all members are content with that, then shall we, can we agree the recommendations?
Yeah, agree.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you for that, Caris, and thank you to all of the officers for the hard work that have gone into the preparation of this document. I'm sure all members would echo Councillor Wilson's comments on that, especially in the current circumstances. If we move on then to item 5, which is the unaudited statement of accounts.
Okay, I'll start with this one then, if that's all right, Chair, and then I'll probably ask some colleagues to come in and help me with some of the detail. So just by way of introduction, what you have in front of you today is the draft statement of accounts for the Vale of Glamorgan Council, which you'll see at Appendix A to your report. The draft statement of accounts for 2019 for the Shared Regulatory Service, which is attached to Appendix B. And also the annual return for the Vale, Valleys and Cardiff Regional Adoption Service for last year, and that's attached to Appendix C for you. It is a legal requirement for these accounts to be produced, and there are regulations in place detailing when these accounts should be presented. Now, for the 2019-20 financial year, the draft accounts should have been completed by the 15th of May 2020, and then they should have been audited and signed off by the 15th of September 2020. However, COVID-19 has impacted on this, and therefore just for this year there's been a revised timetable which requires us to have the draft accounts prepared by the 31st of August this year and the final audited accounts signed off by the 30th of November. Now, we were mindful of that, but actually we wanted to press on in getting the accounts done. So in actual, what's happened this year is that the draft accounts for the council and for the SRS were completed by the 30th of June, and the annual return for the Regional Adoption Service was certified on the 15th of June. Completing these complex and technical documents is always a challenge, but I think has been touched on in the previous agenda item, Chair. It's been a particular challenge for the current financial year. And I wouldn't normally do this, but I just wanted to sort of put on record a thank you really to all of the staff in accountancy who worked so hard to get these accounts closed, first of all. And then a particular mention for Gemma and Carolyn, who are here tonight, for pulling together these documents. It really hasn't been easy with staff working remotely and issues around COVID. So, I mean, it is quite an achievement to get them here to you. And actually, they are here quite in advance of the new requirements for this year. Saying that, I think what we'd like to do now, if Gemma could just talk you through the draft accounts and any key changes from last year and issues which we think you need to be aware of. And then I understand that Steve Wyndham from Audit Wales would also like to say a couple of things about the processes and the issues for them as they do the audit for this financial year. So if that's all right with you, Chair, can I hand over to Gemma?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Caris. Yes, as Caris said, if I run through some of the kind of key issues and assumptions in the accounts for 1920, and then, of course, we are a month into the audit now, so I think Steve wanted to pick up some of the kind of key issues that are going to impact the audit this year. Caris has already touched on the impact of COVID-19 on our timelines. So we did publish a notice on the accounts to say that we would be completing the accounts late, so that was on the website. In terms of technical accounting changes this year, I think fortunately there have been few and far between, but we did streamline the accounts. So you won't see a massive change, but there are some notes that have now been incorporated into statements, and hopefully some of the tables are slightly more simplified. So perhaps you won't see a difference, but it's something that we need to keep on top of going forward. So we perhaps need to look at where the streamlining can be picked up every year going forward. We also had a bit of a change that doesn't have a big impact on the accounts this year, but just wanted to flag it in terms of the go live of the Big Fresh Catering Company on the 1st of January 2020. So the Big Fresh Catering Company aren't required to prepare accounts this year. We're expecting the first set of accounts as at the 31st of March 2021, and we will need to consider, dependent on the materiality, whether in next year's accounts we need to prepare group accounts, which will be an additional set of accounts that remove any incorporating the Big Fresh Catering Company's details, but removing any intra-company transactions. There are some transactions relating to Big Fresh Catering Company in the accounts though. So there is a transfer out in the pension fund that relates to the transfer out associated with the forward liabilities associated with the Big Fresh Catering Company staff. In terms of property, plant and equipment, we had a valuation in year. So we valued all our general fund assets, so not our HRA assets, all our general fund assets, excluding education and social services assets, which were of course valued last year. Now, as part of that valuation, the valuer did put a caveat on that valuation, taking into account the impact of COVID-19. And that's something that Wales Audit Office are considering as part of their audit. Obviously, it's something that impacts all 22 authorities, but it could have an impact on their opinion. I think Steve's going to pick up on that when he talks to you about the accounts. In terms of pensions, there's a lot going on in pensions this year. So first and foremost, we had a triennial valuation that took place in year. So you'll see some big movements. I'll take you through the key statements shortly, but you'll see some big movements in relation to pensions. And part of that is related to the triennial valuation that took place during 1920. We also had a transfer out, as I mentioned, in relation to Big Fresh Catering Company, and a transfer in because we agreed with the auditors as part of the interim work that we would include the pension liability associated with the foundation school in the 1920 accounts. We didn't restate 1819 because it's not a material adjustment, so it's just been transferred in as part of the 1920 accounts. But that is a change to pensions for you to be aware of. Obviously, COVID-19 is a big valuation, not COVID-19, the pension, the actuarial report is a big valuation in the accounts, and there are impacts on the actuarial opinion because they make assumptions about what's going to happen to the population, the pension population going forward, and as part and parcel of that, they make assumptions about mortality, etc. And also because a lot of the funding for the pensions comes from investments, and obviously there was a significant impact on that as part of COVID-19. Now, a lot of the impact on investments is included in the actuary's valuation, but there are some conversations that we're having with Audit Wales and with our colleagues around that. So there's quite a lot of detail in the accounts in terms of the impact on the actuarial valuation to be considered. Obviously, last year we had quite a big adjustment relating to McLeod, and that's something that I think we knew was going to continue to be an issue for the accounts. So as part of the 1920 actuarial review, they included the impact of McLeod, and as part of that, we had to reverse out the 1819 adjustment. We've had some conversations with Audit Wales, and I think in terms of how that's been accounted for, I think we need to adjust that. So there will be some slight changes to the comprehensive income expenditure statement when you come back to see it, hopefully in September, but they won't change the bottom line of the pension reserve. It's purely, as I understand it at the moment, a presentational issue. McLeod has continued to be discussed and continue to raise issues for us as the audit's going on. And we're having conversations with Audit Wales, and we'll be able to give you a bit more of an update when we bring the accounts back to you later in the year. We also have an issue in relation to the guaranteed minimum pension and indexation, and that is also included in the actuarial review. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of pensions for 1920. But those are the main issues in terms of the accounts. I was just going to run through the key statements, which start on, sorry, if I can just bring up the account. So I was going to start with the expenditure and funding analysis, which is on page 15 of the accounts, which is the first appendix. So this statement, I'll just bring my notes back up, takes us from the management accounts to the comprehensive income and expenditure figures. So the figures with the statutory accounting adjustments. So and at the bottom you'll see the surplus, so the movement on the general fund, any general fund earmarked reserves and the HRA reserve. And you'll see that that's an increase of 7 million. Now, the vast majority of that does relate to HRA. There's an increase of 5.28 million on HRA, and that's largely down to not making the revenue contributions to the capital programme that they plan to. There's a reduction on our general fund of 822,000, which is obviously less than we projected the general fund would reduce by, and our earmarked reserves have increased by 2.669. Some of that relates to joint committees, but it's only 185,000. In terms of the movement in reserve statement, which is on the next page to the accounts, again, that echoes the figures that you'll have seen in the expenditure and funding analysis, but it also picks up the other usable reserve movements or the cash back reserve movements. So we've got an increase on capital receipts of 1.3 million. A lot of those capital receipts will be used as part of Band B though. So I would expect those to come down quite significantly in the next few years. And we've got a reduction in capital grants and applied there, going down from 6 million to 3.7 million. So overall, over the year, our usable reserves, our cash back reserves increased from 105 million to 111 million. I just wanted to move on to the comprehensive income and expenditure statement on the next page. I mean, this is a statement where we have brought some of the information that would previously have been in notes into the main statement. So it does look slightly different than in previous years, but hopefully that helps the user of the accounts because it means you're not checking back into notes later on in the account. These figures do include some of the statutory accounting adjustments. So sometimes that accounts for the fluctuation year on year. In terms of sort of the main figures I wanted to pick up, we have got quite a lot of capital grants that have been utilised in year, and the figure is quite significantly higher than in 18-19. It goes up from 29 million to 39 million, so it's quite high. Some of that is around some of those big schemes like 21st Century Schools, and also down the bottom you will see some big adjustments, and these are associated with the fact that we had a revaluation in year. So you've got a 9.6 million change resulting from the revaluation, where you see 2.5 million for impairment losses. These impairment losses aren't to do with suddenly deciding that we need to write 2.5 million out of our off the value of our assets. This is where we've spent capital expenditure and determined that it doesn't enhance the value of the asset. So these are the ones where there is a movement against the revaluation reserve. The other ones are shown against the cost of services at the top. That remeasurement of the net defined benefit, that's 32 million. That's largely due to the triennial valuation in year. And this is a figure that will change. So this is where the where I said that we needed to make an amendment for how we accounted for the McLeod adjustment. This figure will increase, and then the adjustment will be made against the cost of services. That's where you'll see the figures changing for the final account. And then that final figure, the transfer in and out of the net defined benefit liability asset, that's the transfer out of the Big Fresh Catering Company and the transfer in of the foundation school. And then just to look at one last statement, the balance sheet. So we have an increase in property, plant and equipment, which is partly due to the revaluation and partly due to capital expenditure in year. We have got an increase in our investment balances, and this is largely due to us holding high levels of reserves and capital receipts, but we're expecting those to come down a lot of those are earmarked for the capital programme, and particularly Band B, so we're expecting those to come down in future years. We were holding quite a lot of money as an overnight investment, and they're shown against cash and cash equivalents. So that was 11 million on the 31st of March, and that's purely down to trying to manage the cash requirements associated with COVID-19. We were having to pay some money out, and we didn't have as much clarity as we would have liked around cash flow. So we were holding quite a lot of money at 31st of March. Our borrowing is continuing to come down. I know when I brought the Treasury Management Strategy to Audit Committee previously, I've indicated that we're going to have to do significant borrowing over the next couple of years. We're in the process of updating the Treasury Management Strategy at the moment. We need to revisit what's happening with those borrowing projections in light of COVID-19 and capital expenditure over the next couple of years. We've got a couple of figures associated with amounts of Section 106 that we're holding. The grants, receipts and advance capital, I think it's around 27 million now that we're holding on the balance sheet. And then obviously pensions has increased significantly between 1819 and 1920, but with a corresponding adjustment against the pension reserve. So those are the main items I wanted to pick up. I don't know whether you want me to take any questions now, and then I can hand over to Steve.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for that, Gemma, for the very detailed analysis of the accounts, and thank you to you and your team for the work pulling them together. I've had a couple of requests to speak from members. So first of all, Councillor Ian Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just for information, would it be easier for Steve to give his presentation and then we do it in the round rather than fire questions at Gemma now? I don't know what Steve might answer. I don't know whether it's going to go into a different field and then my questions become moot. I don't know what Steve's planning on discussing.
Shall I come in, Chair?
Yes, I'm happy to go with whichever you prefer, Steve.
I haven't really got a great deal to say anyway, so shall I, if I say what I wanted to say, you know, that would then give you the opportunity to decide whether you feel your comments are still relevant or not.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's just to give an update really largely on the audit. There's, as Gemma suggested, there is one particular aspect I need to comment on, and I'll come to that in a moment. But before I go into that, I think it's just worth saying, and you know, I'm sure we all acknowledge this anyway, but we are doing the audit, and the council is being audited in quite trying circumstances. It is a challenge, but it is something we, as Audit Wales, have done. You know, this is my 4th round of doing an audit remotely, for example. So we are getting quite well versed, I think, in doing the audit this way, but there's still nevertheless presents challenges. But you know, all so far so good. We are progressing well. We're on track in delivering the audit. And I think that's testament as well, largely, and it's worth me saying this, to the support and the engagement we're getting from the finance team and from the council. You know, queries are being turned around quickly, working papers are being provided. So, you know, I'd like to put that on record. Really, that has been, you know, to date, a very positive outcomes to date. We're about 4 weeks progressed into the audit, approximately. And so, you know, we're probably about approximately halfway through, maybe a third of the way through, you know, if I had to sort of give you a percentage. And in terms of issues to date, there is one particular issue I probably need to communicate to you. I don't want to set alarm bells ringing, because it just touches upon the very matter which Gemma referred to, and that's in regard to the valuation uncertainty expressed by your valuers in regard to the asset valuations you've undertaken this year. Now, what I'm going to say here is common across every, well, virtually is going to be common across every public body that's had, or every body I can imagine, that's had an asset valuation undertaken this year, where it's material, because we are finding that valuers, per the RICS guidance, are expressing this material uncertainty over the valuations as a result of COVID-19. And what that means is, for us as auditors, is that we need to consider what impact that would have on the user of the accounts. And we are heading to a position whereby we wouldn't qualify the accounts. We're not modifying our opinion. The accounts would remain as true and fair in regard to this matter. But what we would do is introduce a paragraph in our audit report, which is called an emphasis of matter paragraph. And in regard to that paragraph, what we're doing is alerting the reader's attention to the particular paragraph in the Vale's accounts, in the council's accounts, which is on page 35, where that material and uncertainty is being expressed. So it'll just be like a sentence, basically, in our audit report along the lines that, emphasising that there is material uncertainty over the land and building valuations, and referring the user, the reader of the accounts, to page 35, where that particular communication is made. And following on from that, it's worth, again, me just reiterating, I think this is going to be common across most local government audits this year. So I don't want to sort of set hairs running and alarm you. It's a process we need to go through. And it's, yeah, just to communicate that, really. And also, as Gemma quite rightly pointed out, we are also considering whether there's any material uncertainty in regard to the actuarial valuations, in regard to the investments, in regard to the pension fund. That's something we're still exploring, so it's way too early to even comment on that in terms of how we are concluding. But it is, as I say, just to alert you, something we are working through in conjunction with our technical team, of our local government audit colleagues, and of course colleagues in the Vale's finance team. That's all I particularly want to say about the accounts of this month in terms of our audit, but obviously happy to take any questions. But as I say, we are in this sort of grey area at the moment, where we are still working through the audit process, and it is in many ways early days.
Okay, thank you for that, Steve. If we move on to questions from members, then Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Carys, Gemma and Steve for their comments there. I think Steve captures the uncertainty of the situation, the unprecedented times in which we find ourselves, and an audit committee is naturally something that gets caught very much in the crosshairs, of that, because the level of certainty that is required in much of this simply does not exist at this time, and therefore we can't. I'm sure this as a committee we're not blasé about that, nor would we wish to be judgmental about something over which actually the council has relatively limited control. So in that context, echoing echoing earlier, thank you to everybody who's been putting this work together, this very detailed set of accounts, in very unusual circumstances that I don't think anybody would have assumed when we were halfway through the year or 2/3 of the way through the year, that the last couple of weeks of this as a financial year would have been spent doing what we did. So in that context, there's material here which is about us looking back on 2019-20, which was running as normal until the very final quarter in the last few weeks, and where that leaves us going forward. Going forward is obviously we don't know, and I think that's an appropriate response to say that we don't have that crystal ball that can tell us what will happen. All we can do is make assumptions based on what we do know and the various possibilities that are there. What we can do though is look back on 2019-20, because that was broadly a normal year, and see what we thought of it. There are a couple of points that stand out for me. So the council did, despite the challenges that we wanted our public to recognise, the council did actually turn a £7 million surplus in its figures last year, according to the expenditure and funding analysis. According to note 13, the council tax take for the Vale of Glamorgan Council went up by £5.5 million. These are noticeably large figures which are worthy of stating on the record, because they don't otherwise get mentioned by people unless you want to look through lots and lots and lots of tables in order to pull them out. There are a couple of points I'm particularly interested in. Gemma has already referred to issues regarding the pensions valuations. Naturally, that's affected some of the unusable reserves, I think, that comes in. What I'm particularly interested in is our total usable reserves figure and the relationship with unusable reserves. This is complex, which is why I'm asking for a clarification here, because it refers to note 10, which is 2 pages worth of calculations and not something that's easily understandable. Our total usable reserves suggest an increase of almost £20 million, with then £14 million being substituted into the unusable reserves, leaving us with an increase in our usable cash reserves, our cash back reserves, as suggested earlier, of £6 million. I'd like a little bit of explanation as to the relationship between that £14 million that's gone from the usable reserves to the unusable reserves, and I don't know if this is related to it, just a clarification around where we're anticipating our Band B school spending going in future. Reason for this is that we are consistently told about we consistently raise the issue of the amount of reserves that we hold on a political level in council meetings, whether it's here or in full council. We're always told there are plans to spend them, and yet it always seems there's more in the reserves whenever I look at them in these meetings and the annual accounts are prepared. There's certainly a very different figure presented here than there was in February when we were discussing the amount of reserves and determining our council tax. And that variation is quite substantial again. So I just like to appreciate a little bit of understanding as to, as I say, why the 20 million, well, there's a £20 million increase in usable reserves, followed by a note which has a 14 million change to unusable reserves, so leaving us with 6 million increase. Because I think that would help me to understand some of these points in the movement and reserve statement. Thank you, Chair and Gemma.
Okay, Chair, if I can reply to that. The council has, under the CITSA code, the council has statutory override for a number of items that would otherwise hit the council taxpayer. So items such as depreciation, adjustments on the pension liability. So they all have a statutory override, and they go into the unusable reserves. So unusable reserves are not cash backed, they're accounting adjustments. And so, for instance, the pension reserve is equal and opposite to the pension liability because it's an adjusting figure. So there hasn't been a 20 million movement on usable reserves. They are adjustments that have to be taken through the comprehensive income and expenditure statement. So, for instance, a revaluation adjustment that doesn't hit the revaluation reserve would go to the capital adjustment account. So it would be charged in the cost of services, and then through the adjustments note, then it would be taken out to the capital adjustment account. So that's why you see that movement, but the movement is equal and opposite, if that makes sense. Our cashback reserves are purely our usable reserves. Now, I haven't got the exact figures in terms of the Band B spend, but I can certainly email them based on the latest approvals. There is a significant amount of capital receipts that will be utilised, and the school investment strategy reserve is entirely used up, but there will be very little left in that. And we will also be contributing general capital funding, and there will be unsupported borrowing taking place to support the scheme. In addition, there will be contributions from section 106. So those amounts that I pointed out on the balance sheet earlier, they will also be contributing to Bambi. But as you can imagine, those because it's such a large scheme, those amounts change quite regularly. So I just want to check what the latest figures are, and then I will circulate those to Audit Committee members, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you, Gemma. Councillor Mark Wilson.
Can I thank Gemma, first of all, and the team for producing these accounts, given the circumstances that we're in at the moment. Again, like on the governance statement, you know, it's just pretty amazing that you produce all this. It's very impressive data. There's a few points I'd like to make, though. On page 1, on the actual unaudited statement of accounts of a narrative, I think it might be quite good to add the fact that when we said the council was a number of committees that fulfil various scrutiny, that we also include audit on that as well. We don't actually make reference to the audit on here, which I find quite amusing in some respects, but I think we should. I think that's a point that we should make, because otherwise, you know, some people will say, well, it's not going to audit, surely it should be audited. And of course it is, but I think we do need to flag that up with people as well. On page 2, you mentioned the term lead time a couple of times. Not everyone understands lead time. I think perhaps you could change that wording to take it, maybe to take a while to achieve those savings. Something a bit better than something using that lead time. I mean, I use lead times when I talk about stop work or whatever, when I teach business studies. So you've got to be a bit careful sometimes in the terminology that you use. The other thing in terminology is when you talk about employees' expenses. Now that kind of gives the impression that we're claiming all these expenses, and what I think what you mean is wages and salaries predominantly on this. So perhaps maybe that needs to be clarified a bit as well. And the other thing is, I only found a technical incorrection or something that needs explaining. Page 92 on the accounts. I mean, if you want to go forward on that, in terms of, I think it is in terms of housing stock. You mentioned, if you look at the figures on number of types of dwellings, 3875 and 3867, although that talks about 8, the differences are between different figures. It doesn't quite add up. So perhaps maybe that needs a bit of explaining as well, because I got the impression that there is new build here, because the number 1 bedroom houses has gone up from 0 to 6, yet you say on the data below there's no new builds. But perhaps maybe that needs to be looked at, because it doesn't seem to be correct. I may be wrong, but on the site of it, it doesn't seem to be. So maybe that's the sort of only thing I sort of found as an error, but I'd be interested to see if that is right or not. Thank you. And can I also make the general point, and this is answer to Dr. Ian Johnson here, Councillor Johnson, that I am very pleased with the financial performance of the council. We've been one hell of a mess if we had deteriorating differences. And the fact is, we've had an increase in investments, and we had a reduction in debts. And to be honest, I think that's what you want. And we had an increase in reserves. And to be honest, that's what we need, given the situation that we're all facing at the moment with COVID. I mean, I know with the cabinet report, there are issues, obviously, with COVID, as we expect, but we're in a damn sight better position than an awful lot of other councils, given the fact that we have been prudent over a number of years. So I would like to make that point.
I think that's on the record, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yep, I think we're happy to look at making those changes, and I'll have to go away and look at the figures on page 92 and feedback, but we can certainly look to clarify them if they need correcting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other members who wish to make questions or comments? I know that Councillor Johnson would like to come in again. I will go to Mr. Lewis first because you haven't spoken yet, and then I'll come back to Councillor Johnson.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to echo Mark's comments about our improving position in the council. Ever since I've been the lay member on this committee, in the last 8 or 9 years, we've had strain upon strain upon strain trying to make ends meet. And it does look as though we've done a sterling job at trying to improve our financial position in the last year. I spent a long time this afternoon going through these accounts in detail, which is why I haven't got them in front of me, because I more or less remembered all the comments that Dr. Johnson and Mark has made. And I didn't pick up the one about new housing stock, but I do think he's right there. There probably is a mathematical error, just a small mathematical error there. But what I'm more concerned about really is whether or not we have any concerns going forward with COVID-19. Now, I know that they are, it's an ongoing crisis, and we can't really anticipate what's going to happen next. But are there any real concerns in the finance department about what might or what might not happen, or do we think we've got a handle on it, sort of thing? That's the only thing I want to ask, really.
I think that's possibly for me to take, Chair, is it? Obviously, we're monitoring the situation very closely. We are currently drawing together reports that will report on our spend for the first quarter of this year. They will also report on the funding assistance that we've had via Welsh Government and how much of our additional spend that has been able to cover. And they will also look at, we're going to try and estimate additional spend for the rest of this financial year. But as you've already said, Mr. Lewis, that's going to be quite a challenge, really, because things are still very fluid and things are still changing significantly all the time. But our intention is to bring a report into Cabinet in September, early in September, outlining all of those issues. If you're asking me at the moment, am I in panic mode? No. But I mean, there is obviously significant financial pressure, and we're pulling all of that together at the moment. Does that answer your query?
I think that's a thumbs up, although the screen seems to have frozen a bit. But any other members wish to make any questions or comments on this item? Okay, I'll hand back over to Councillor Johnson then.
Thank you very much, Chair. I mean, there's a couple of comments made since I last spoke, so I'll just address if I just address those quickly. And obviously, as on a corporate level and as an individual level, we make a decision on the appropriate level of risk and the appropriate amounts of money that should be held by the council. My take is that we shouldn't be consistently taking money from council taxpayers at an above inflationary level in order to ensure that our council bank balance is in a good place. A lot of the people I represent are in far worse situations than the council are, and I don't think we should be taking above inflation amounts consistently when we have hold substantial reserves and consistently do so, and consistently turn a surplus. That's a great thing for the people that do the work, but it's reflective of cuts from Welsh Government, but also it's not necessary every time to pick up huge amounts of money. If I could just, the question I was actually going to raise was regarding the housing revenue account. The reference earlier from Gemma, I think it was about the fact that some of the money that was ordinarily turned from, I'm trying to remember which way around, whether it's capital to revenue or revenue to capital, wasn't done so in the year just gone. That's made a large amount of the surplus that I've just been referring to. I'm just wondering what the policy decision behind that is for 1920 compared to previous years, and sort of how that's intended to be taken forward, noting on the one hand a substantial increase in the rents, I think it's up £1 million or so in these figures last year, but also a substantial increase in the arrears of £500,000 last year as well. So I think I'd just like some comments from Caris on HRA and its wider guise. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Caris.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as Gemma rightly pointed out, a lot of the surplus this year was in relation to HRA.
Caris, we've lost your audio.
Yeah.
Sorry, is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. As Gemma pointed out, a lot of the surplus that you've seen through the statement of accounts was in relation to the HRA. And when we did the revised estimates back in November time, there was a provision in the HRA for bad debt, really in relation to welfare reform rolling out and whether or not it would hit the rent arrears. It didn't materialise last year at the level that we'd anticipated, and therefore we were anticipating spending that money in support of the capital programme. However, when we closed the accounts, there was some slippage on the capital programme in housing. So the result of that was that there was a significant surplus on the HRA. The outcome of that is that actually the balance for the HRA is considerably higher than we planned for. But we will be reviewing that because we update the HRA business plan every year. So we will be reviewing that now during this year, ready for next year's accounts. And the plan would still be that that money is used to assist in funding the capital programme where it can, because that reduces the debt for the HRA and therefore reduces the ongoing costs that the revenue account needs to pick up. Does that answer your query? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Caris. Just one final shout to any members who may wish to make questions or comments on this. Okay, in that case, I have one question for, oh, sorry, Gemma.
No, sorry, it's okay. I was just going to say, can I just very briefly revisit the SRS accounts and adoption before you move on to the recommendations? Sorry.
I was going to ask Steve a question on this, if that's all right, before doing that, Gemma, if that's okay. Thanks for that. Okay, first of all, just a quick question for Steve. It's in relation to your comments on the COVID crisis and the impacts it's had both on asset valuations and on the pension liabilities. I take the current context and the situation and the uncertainty that that's caused. So obviously it's going to have an impact by default on this council and our accounts and our finances. But I would just ask a question. Is there anything you've identified that you would consider to be unique to this council rather than just more general, albeit very serious concerns that will apply to not just other councils, but other public bodies as well?
Yes, of course, I can answer that. The answer quite simply is no, really. There aren't any. To date, you know, I'm sorry I need to put in that caveat, but that's the nature of where we're at, really. The audit is progressing, and whilst we, you know, of course there are issues. Gemma pointed out earlier about an audit adjustment in regard to McLeod, which doesn't affect the bottom line, but there's still nevertheless an audit adjustment. There's also other audit adjustments that we're still fleshing out and working through potentially, but none of those are material, and none of those, some of those, well, may not even have an impact on the bottom line. But as ever with an audit process, it takes a little while to sort of tease out these issues, conclude upon them and firm up what the actual impact of those issues could potentially be. But as to date, there's nothing material I need to communicate to you.
Okay, thank you for that. And that's
Okay.
something that everyone on the committee will welcome. If I hand over to Gemma then for SRS. Oh, Mr. Lewis.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I've unmuted now. I don't know if it's relevant to mention at this point, but my understanding with the pensions reserves are that we could in fact see a positive benefit from this, because the mortality rate amongst older people is much higher than the younger people. And the feedback that I'm getting from my pension provider is that the pension surplus will increase rather than decrease. I believe that's useful.
If anybody wishes to address that point,
Chair, through you, obviously we will be liaising with Cardiff and Vale Pension Funds and the actuary in the over the coming period, probably looking over 2021 and trying to gauge whether any of those assumptions need to be revised, whether we need to think about bringing forward evaluation. So the actuary indicated that they're not sure what's going to happen with their a variety of their assumptions. Obviously, they make assumptions around inflation and things as well. So the actuary indicated they're not sure what's going to happen with those assumptions, and we just need to keep that under review really in the coming year.
Did Councillor Johnson want to come in there?
Just very briefly, Chair, I just wanted to make the point that we're in a situation which is very much unknown as to the impacts upon all of this, never mind actuarial valuations of pensions. I just, I don't think it needs to be said, but I hope that when people do live longer and we don't have more people die.
Right, I'll hand back to Gemma then for SRS.
Just very quickly on the SRS account. So I'm not intending to go into great detail. I just wanted to flag up that as part of the 18-19 audit, we did agree that going forward we would amend the format of the accounts so they would be brought into line with the SRS monitoring. So you might notice that for instance, the comprehensive income expenditure statement, whereas previously it would have shown categories of expenditure, for instance, employees, supplies and services, now it shows the various service areas, including the specific services that we operate on behalf of the partner authorities. SRS will be impacted by not the PPE uncertainty because they haven't got any land and buildings and there weren't any revaluations in the year, but they will be impacted by the various issues with pensions in terms of McLeod and the actuarial review. So something to bear in mind, and the changes we see in the Vale accounts we will probably see in the SRS accounts as well. I just wanted to give you the headline figures on the SRS account. I think in terms of what was reported, the outturn position was an overall 46,000 deficit. Both Bridgend and the Vale achieved surpluses with an overspend against Cardiff, and that's associated with licensing. But the audit in terms of SRS hasn't really got going. There's been some initial work happen so far, but I think that's going to get going a bit more in the coming weeks. So we're not quite as far advanced with the audit there, but we know that there are issues around pensions, so we just keep those under review. Can I just hand over to Carolyn? She'll just give us a couple of highlight, a bit of an overview on adoption. Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, as you can see, the adoption accounts is a lot smaller. It's only just the one table in the annual return. But just to say that the internal audit department have been through and looked at all the processes and the internal controls that the adoption service are running. And as you can see, part of the document is them actually confirming that they are happy with those controls and that everything is in order. I think, as I say, it's a lot smaller level, only around about £2 million of income and expenditure. I think I just wanted to point out that the income and expenditure has gone up by about £500,600 in the year, and I just wanted to explain that that was due to in year Welsh Government provided an additional grant of £537,000 for the adoption service. Of which 193,000 was actually spent by the Vale and Valleys Adoption Regional Service, and the remainder of 344,000 was distributed between the partners RCT, Merthyr, Cardiff and the Vale. The individual partners spent the unprocured staff through the 344,000, but the actual grant income was all claimed by the adoption service. So that's why if you look at the accounts, you can see that the income's gone up substantially between years, and hence the expenditure's gone up. Just to say that it was mainly spent on staffing to help with transitions, to procure birth parent advisors, and also to help with life journey delivery, working with parents and obviously the children that were adopted. And just to say that as a positive, that grant is actually continuing into 2021, so that level of expenditure will continue into 2021. I think that's all I wanted to say. As I say, it's a massively reduced document to the statement of accounts for the Vale and the SRS. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Do we have any questions or comments from members? Okay, I think we can move on to adopting the recommendations then. Just a bit of housekeeping for the records. It's important that each member states that they're satisfied with the recommendations being adopted. So I'm going to go through all members individually to make sure that that is placed on the record, and I will do that for agenda item 4 as well, if that's okay. So can you please either suggest content or not for the record. So I will start, I'm content with both items 4 and the statement of accounts. Councillor Ian Johnson.
I support the recommendations for items 4 and items 5 of this agenda. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Pamela Drake.
I'm content, thank you.
Councillor Mark Wilson.
Yeah, I'm happy to support recommendations in respect of agenda item 4 and agenda item 5.
Councillor Leighton Rowlands.
Yes, I'm happy to support the recommendations in 4 and 5 of the agenda items.
Councillor Catherine McCaffer.
Yes, I'm content, thank you.
Councillor Jane Norman. Councillor Jane Norman.
I'm happy to support both items.
And Mr. Lewis.
Yes, I'm quite happy with that. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's both recommendations adopted then. If we then move on to item 6, which is the annual internal audit report.
Hey, thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, just before going into the report, I'd just like to perhaps say that this is the most important report of the year from an internal audit perspective. But I'd just like to mention that this is now a consistent format report across all 4 of the councils that the regional internal audit service works for. So we've taken the opportunity of taking the best from each of the 4 styles of annual reports that have been presented previously, and hopefully ended up with an improved document and removed some of the duplication in some of the reports. And I'd also like to thank the internal audit team for the work they've done during the year to enable this report to be produced, and in particular Joan for managing the team and helping to pull this report together. In terms of the actual report, the purpose of the report is to provide the Head of Internal Audit's annual opinion on the Council's control environment in relation to governance, risk management and internal control, and to inform the Audit Committee of the work and performance of internal audit for the financial year 2019-20. On the first page of the report, as members can see, it sets out the executive summary. So if I just go through those points briefly. The report provides the annual opinion, as I referred to, on the Council's control environment in relation to governance, risk management, internal controls. It also informs the Audit Committee of the work and performance of internal audit for the financial year 2019-20. And this information is provided in order to comply with the public sector internal audit standards that we have to abide by. Appendix A is the more lengthy document, which is the actual internal audit annual report itself, which details internal audit performance, opinions and recommendations made during the year, which assist in forming the Head of Internal Audit's annual opinion on the Council's overall control environment. And from the work undertaken during the year and considering other sources of assurance, the Head of Audit's annual opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's framework of governance, risk management and control for the year is reasonable assurance, so that's positive. The actual outturn against 2019 risk-based plan is attached at Annex B, which I'll cover in a little bit more detail later on. And one of the things that we expected to say for this year is obviously what impact COVID-19 had on our audit work for 1920, obviously because COVID obviously impacted relatively late in the financial year and in the final stages of March. It had little impact on the plan, as most of the field work had been completed prior to lockdown, so it didn't have a major impact for last year. It will have more of an impact for the current financial year, but that's a different point that we'll discuss at another time. Taking members over the page in terms of the report, in terms of the background, I've already said about the public sector internal audit standards require the head of audit provide an annual report to support the annual governance, and it's sets out there 5 bullet points in terms of what's expected in that annual report. 1.2 there, in accordance with those standards, the head of internal audit is responsible for developing a risk-based annual audit plan, which takes into account the Council's risk management framework. And within the standards, there's a requirement for the head of audit to review and adjust the plan as necessary as the year goes by in response to changes in the Council's business, risks, operations, programmes, and so on. But I also have to make sure that the internal audit's resources are appropriate, sufficient, and effectively deployed to achieve the approved plan. And just by way of a reminder, essentially the internal audit plan was approved by Audit Committee on the 30th of April 2019, and it outlined the assignments to be carried out and the respective priorities. And if you recall, as it was the first year of the newly created regional service, a transitional year where flexibility would be required to deal with the demands of setting up a new service. And we certainly won't forget the end of the first year in a hurry, because for obvious reasons. Moving on to section 2 of the report in terms of key issues for consideration. The internal audit annual report is added Appendix A, which I've already mentioned. It summarises the work that we've undertaken, including any counter-fraud work, recommendations made, and any control issues we identified. A total of 62 reviews were completed with an audit opinion, and a total of 228 medium and high recommendations were made. And again, that's covered in more detail in the main report. The report covers or discusses the performance of the service, discusses the progress against the plan, which I've touched on, and I'd just like to make the point really that most planned reviews have been undertaken during 1920 despite the reduced staff and resources. Where planned work has not been undertaken, assurance has been gained where possible from other sources such as the World's Audit Office on safeguarding, for example. Some planned reviews were reassessed during the year and a decision made not to undertake the work. One was carried forward to be completed during 2021, whilst 3 audits were not started and will be considered as part of the 2021 plan. I think what I'll do now, in terms of moving on to the actual report itself, take members in a little bit of detail. So if I refer you to page 2 of Appendix A, hopefully you can see that. That just covers the introduction, so I won't go through that again. I think I've covered that sufficiently. Section 2 on page 2 just is a reminder really of the opinions that we give when we normally when we carry out a piece of work. We give an opinion on what we found, so we can give a range of 4 different opinions ranging from substantial assurance, reasonable assurance, down to limited and no assurance. But table 1 there on page 3, if I can draw your attention to that, you'll see there a breakdown of the number of audits in different categories and the total and percentage columns at the end on the right hand side of that table. And that shows that 49 of the 62 audits give a substantial or a reasonable assurance, an opinion, and that equates to 79% of the audits that were carried out, which quite a significant positive percentage. There were, however, 13 audits that we carried out with a limited opinion, which is 21%. And I'll mention those a bit later on in the report. But overall, I think it's a positive reflection on the internal control environment that is operating at the Vale of Glamorgan Council. Okay, if I move on to section 3, which is on page 4 of the report, I mentioned about the limited reports, and there were 13 in total. Now, the vast majority of these Audit Committee will be familiar with, because we've reported on any limited reports as the year went through, but there are 5 reports that basically concluded after the last Audit Committee. So the ones just to mention are ICT Business Continuity Planning Follow-up, FOI Freedom of Information Support Desk System, a Contractor Final Account, and moving on to page 6, there was a capital scheme award. So just to mention, those were the ones that were had a limited opinion. Obviously, we've made recommendations to management in terms of addressing the issues that we identified to manage those risks going forward. That takes me on to section 4 of the report, the recommendations on page 6 and 7. If I draw your attention to table 2 at the top of page 7, that shows there that basically we give recommendations. They could be in categories, 3 different categories: high, medium, or merits attention. So the most important, obviously most significant, are the high priority, followed by the medium, and you can see there then that there was a total of 228 recommendations made. 96% of those were medium recommendations, and 9 or 4% were high priority. And we identify there in table paragraph 4.3 the recommendations with the high priority, and also paragraph 4.4, just so members are clear on where those recommendations were made. The merits attention recommendations, we don't specifically record them. They are things that we draw to management's attention that we think is worth them considering, but we don't actually report on those formally. Moving on to page 8 of the report, section 5, counter fraud work. Obviously, as well as planned work, we get cases or concerns referred to as potential fraud or irregularity. We had 9 potential fraud or irregularity cases referred to us during 1920. So we looked at all of those and basically gave an opinion in relation to 3 of those. Others were fact-finding pieces of work where information was referred to management, and if appropriate, disciplinary action was considered as part of the process of dealing with those. Paragraph 5.3 on the same page, on page 8, mentions the National Fraud Initiative, and we will be bringing a more detailed report to Audit Committee probably in September around our work in relation to National Fraud Initiative. But during 2019-20, we've identified £192,000 worth of recoverable fraud or errors as a result of working through the data matches through the National Fraud Initiative. And that's been a pretty successful year in comparison with other authorities. So I'm quite pleased with the work that's been done there, and obviously quite a bit of that well, not quite a bit, a lot of that money will be recovered over time. And I just wanted to mention as well that Audit Wales have asked us for a couple of examples of case studies of the work we've done, so they can put that forward as best practice as well, because they recognise that we put quite a bit of effort into this piece of work, and they want to show what we've done to other authorities. Moving on then on to section 6, which is on page 9, just a few issues in relation to performance measures and client satisfaction questionnaires. At the conclusion of every audit, we issue a questionnaire to get feedback on how the audit went and their views on how it was conducted, the views of how the auditor performed, and so on. The questions are set out there in the table under paragraph 6.1, and there's just 2 examples there of some of the narrative feedback that we've had from services that we've ordered. An area for improvement, I think, for us is the numbers of returns that we get as reduced over recent years, and that's something that we're hoping that we can automate the process for chasing up responses through the new audit software that we've procured, and we will be rolling that out later on this financial year. Moving on then to page 10, it just refers to, for example, the importance of staff training. You know, it's very much a people business in terms of auditing and having to deal with people. You need people who are professionally qualified and experienced to undertake the work. It mentions there we've got 2 members of staff who are undertaking professional qualification. SIPFA, Nathan Smith is the final stages of his SIPFA qualification, and another member of staff is undertaking the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors qualification as well. And then all staff obviously undertake other courses, particularly using the online facilities, which has become obviously invaluable in the current climate. Section 8 onto page 11 identifies some key performance measures around benchmarking. This is always a year behind because the benchmarking information by the time it's collated across Wales is a year out of date, but it shows the performance for the previous year in terms of percentage of planned audits complete is 94% against the Welsh Chief Auditor's average of 85%. And their 72% were completed in planned time, and we obviously monitor that as the year goes on. Section 9 is a requirement. I have to state whether the Internal Audit Service complies with the public sector internal audit standards. So there's a short section there confirming that is the case. And turning over the page again onto page 12 and section 10 just gives a sort of a page summary in terms of the progress in relation to the Regional Internal Audit Service. So some of the things that we've achieved in terms of identifying a vision, the immediate priorities for the service that were identified over a year ago, and we were able to achieve those 5 points there. And then 3 other priorities for the service of the first 12 months, which was to develop a structure taking account of 2B requirements and so on, confirm an ICT solution and arrangements, and identify and evaluate different approaches and methodologies for each internal audit team, and identify most appropriate to adopt. In terms of the structure has been developed and has now been agreed by the 4 constituent authorities, so very pleased about that. Be looking to try and recruit in the near future, particularly when the restrictions around the pandemic allow. In terms of, I've already mentioned this, in terms of new ICT equipment was purchased for all staff to ensure consistency and compatibility, and without that kit obviously we would have struggled very much to be able to work remotely, so that's been very helpful. And in terms of the software solution, we've identified a particular piece of software called MKI Insight, which has already been in use in the Rhondda Cynon Taf team. We had a look at a few other alternatives, but basically confirmed that was the best solution for us. So we've gone through an exercise in terms of procurement of that, and that has been purchased and will be rolled out later on in the year. The area that we still need to develop more is really evaluating different approaches, because we've got in fact 3 approaches in some respects around the detail of how audits are conducted. Now, having the audit software will allow us to be able to standardize that approach and have a more consistent approach, which is one of the benefits of having a shared service, for example. Okay, moving on to what is probably the most important bit, which is the opinion statement, and I've already given you the headlines there as part of my introduction. So on page 14 and 15 it covers the opinion statement. I've already mentioned that the public sector internal audit standards require me to give an opinion on risk management, governance and internal control. So 3 separate opinions there, and I'm pleased to be able to say that I can give a reasonable assurance to all 3 aspects that's covered as mentioned on page 15 of the report. And then that's summarised on page 16, which is the overall statement. So the overall opinion is of reasonable assurance. And referred, I think, earlier on to Annex 1 and Annex 2, which goes into more detail about individual audits, the opinions that we gave, and the number of recommendations made. So perhaps I'll pause there, Chair, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark, and for that very comprehensive analysis of the report. I have had a request from Councillor Mark Wilson to speak. Just before I start, I am conscious that Barry Town Council are meeting at 7 o'clock, and that a lot of our members are twin-hatted. So if we could get through this before they have to go elsewhere, that would be helpful, just for members to bear in mind as they ask questions. Councillor Wilson. Mark, can you get your mic on, please?
All right, you can hear me now. So yes. I'll just go back to what I just did actually say. Can I thank you very much, Mark, for that comprehensive report. It's very informative. But there are a few points I'd like you to have a look at. On page 18 of 19, We have got quite a lot of recommendations being made, and one thing perhaps it might be good for us to, as members of the audit committee, to know the difference between high recommendations and medium recommendations. And thirdly, why there's no such thing as low recommendations here, because obviously you've got high, medium, I would have thought there'd be low. And the other point is payroll. That seems to be an issue here with All Saints and Stanwell in particular. I know basically you're going to have a follow up with All Saints. I've read that, but it doesn't seem to be a follow up with Stanwell. And I'm just wondering, perhaps, can we go back to Stanwell if need to? Because clearly there are lots of recommendations that you make on those. You made 10 in relation to Stanwell, and you made 16 in relation to All Saints. And also, perhaps the other question I'm going to ask in relation to all this is how much training do people get in those areas to make sure that they won't have to have so many recommendations? Are there things that they should go on, courses or whatever, so they don't have these kind of issues, you know, so they have a better understanding, so they don't fall into a limited assurance in terms of their audit?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll try and cover those points quickly, picking up what the chair mentioned. Yeah, in relation to high, medium and merits attention, we call them sort of as the third sort of priority recommendations. There are criteria that we use in terms of defining what's a high and what's a medium and what's a merits attention. And I'm going to ask Joan maybe to come in shortly to sort of supplement what I've said in terms of the detail around that. In terms of payroll, the two examples that you mentioned around Stanwell and All Saints, because they are limited reports, we will automatically follow up on those to see what the progress has been in terms of implementing recommendations. And I think I'm right in saying as well, in terms of Stanwell, because of the nature of that particular school and the audit, that the Audit Wales as well have to look at it from the point of view of the accounts as well. So again, Joan can perhaps fill in some of the details around the nature of some of the recommendations in terms of, and perhaps what aspects of training may be helpful. Was there another point, Councillor Wilson? I may not have covered all of your points.
I was just saying, in order to try and reduce the amount of limited reports, because after all, we don't want situations where every time we go in, there are quite a lot of, not quite a lot, but some limited reports. We want to try and reduce that. What I'm interested in is the amount of training that people go on in particular, so they have a good understanding, so they don't fall into those traps of having lots of recommendations imposed upon them. You see what I mean?
So yeah, well, perhaps I'll ask Joan if she could come in at that point, if that's okay, Joan.
Yeah, hello, good evening. Yeah, following on from what Mark has said, the fundamental or high recommendations lead usually to a limited assurance report, and both All Saints and Stanwell were limited, and they will be followed up. The other fundamental recommendations were around the catering, and fundamental means it's something that really compromises the control environment, and we feel that it's something that needs immediate attention. This was around the catering service at the time, because there was such a short time scale for the service to become the big fresh catering company. So we felt at that time, within a 4-week window, there would be a lot of governance issues if things weren't addressed. Things moved quite quickly, and we revisited that as a follow-up a month later, and although recommendations were made, the fundamental nature of those recommendations were downgraded to significant. And that's something we're going to keep an eye on as we go through. As far as training is concerned, particularly at schools, we work closely with Learning and Skills and the schools team there, and the schools team are developing their web-based reference points for schools, particularly the school admin team. Also, school admin officers can access any online training. They're also, we've got quite a good working relationship with the school clerks. They know they can ring us for any advice and guidance, and we can point them to IDEV training, which is the council's online training, and we can also point them to the direction of any financial procedure notes or any references that we think may help them. So as far as formal training, there's lots of electronic training that everybody is aware of, and we will point them in that direction if we feel that it's appropriate. I'm not sure, does that answer all your questions?
Is it possible I can come back on that, Chair? Can I come back on that, Chair?
Yeah, sure.
I just wondered perhaps, can we insist upon that training being undertaken, given the fact, you know, I mean, especially when it's regarded limited in particular?
Yeah, if it was appropriate, we would include it in our recommendation that there would be training for whatever it may be. So yeah, we would make a recommendation if we felt it was appropriate formally. If we felt though it was a new clerk and it was just a matter of they were learning, we would just point them in that direction without making that formal recommendation.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Ian Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Say thanks to Mark for the presentation there. I think it's been a very interesting first year for the regional internal audit service and very successful one. So I think that's something for us to be celebrating. Obviously, this year is going to be quite different in the context of COVID-19 and how that will be dealt with in terms of internal audit. Just some very brief points on the work programme. First, I note that one of the issues that wasn't conducted last year was with regards to homelessness. That's been pushed into 2020, 2021, according to the appendix here. I'd just like to state the importance of that. We're aware that that under the new circumstances, homelessness is a pressure point issue, and also the resolution of homelessness and the end of rough sleeping, I think, is a good aim to have. So I think that's very important. There's reference within the appendices also to the fact that we didn't go forward with a report on safeguarding because WAO were doing similar work. I think that needs to be unpacked and explained in this wider context. And just to echo, I think, Councillor Wilson's comments, I'm fairly sure that every year, obviously, Mark, you've only been with us for just over 15 months now, but I'm fairly sure every year we have a handful of schools who've fallen foul of our internal audit. So it might be worth just considering whether there is a systemic issue that needs resolution here, because it does feel like something that comes up with 2 or maybe 3 schools on an annual basis. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Johnson. I think I caused most of the questions. I think at the start you may have faded out a little bit. I think you started by saying about how the COVID would impact on delivering the audit service going forward. Is that the first point you made?
It wasn't really intended as a question. It was more a comment that I'm sure it'll be more difficult this year than last year, and last year went very well. If you want to comment briefly, that's up to you, but I'm aware of time considerations that I know people have.
Well, very briefly, obviously, it will impact on how we conduct our audits now currently and going forward. Obviously, we're not unable to sort of go and see people as we would historically have done because everybody's working remotely. So it's very much reliant on using the technology, using things like Teams to have remote meetings, being able to share screens, share documentation and evidence electronically and so on. Very much like I would imagine as Audit Wales are having to work as well. It's just internal audit tend to go out to visit establishments and different offices, perhaps more frequently than our colleagues in Audit Wales. So that is quite a change in terms of how we will approach things. So technology will certainly assist us on that, and we'll have to wait and see how things go in terms of visiting schools, for example, and other social service establishments. I can't see that coming into effect for this financial year. There's so many unknowns in terms of how the virus will develop or maybe spike or whatever's going to happen. So we will be doing a lot more work remotely, and as I said, calling for requesting evidence electronically. But going back to some of the other points that you made, yes, homelessness obviously is a very important area, and very interestingly, obviously, money was found to if I can say, help deal with the homelessness issue during the COVID period. So I'd be interested in terms of how things are now have now developed since then. Safeguarding, yes, you rightly said that we chose not to look at safeguarding directly. We look at it when we look at schools and individual examples, but we chose not to look at it sort of corporately because Will's Audit Office colleagues were already conducting a piece of work, but we will be picking that up again in the coming year, because it's an important area that we have to keep an eye on. In relation to schools, yes, and sort of my reflection on what's happening in a few other authorities, there seem to be a handful of schools, and most authorities that crop up from time to time with various issues, whether that's a training issue or maybe the nature of the beast. One of the things I think we need to do as a regional audit service is trying to come up with a common self-evaluation process, for example, and maybe develop a bit of a common training sort of handbook, if that's the right word, for schools. The issue is for us is that the schools in the 4 authorities will have slightly different procedures and systems to use, so it's that'll be an interesting one for us to think about. But yeah, I'm not sure if it's a systemic issue, but it's something that I have noticed across. It's not peculiar to the Vale, and it's common to a number of authorities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. Do we have any other questions or comments from members? Okay, well, given that time is against us and there is another meeting. Oh, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a brief one, really. I won't keep you very long. I know time is limited. Mark, I address this to you. I noticed that you improved the way in which you're presenting your annual report, and I must say it's work well done, because I found it much easier and much better to read. So thank you for that, and good luck with the forthcoming year.
Okay, do we have any other questions or comments from members? Okay, well, given the imminent start of the next meeting, if we move on to the recommendations, then the recommendation as written in the report at paragraph 1, I'm happy to endorse the recommendation. I will go around each member individually. Councillor Ian Johnson.
Support the recommendation, Chair.
Councillor Pamela Drake.
For the recommendation.
Councillor Mark Wilson.
For the recommendation.
Councillor Leighton Rowlands.
For the recommendation.
Councillor Catherine McCaffer.
For the recommendation.
Councillor Jane Norman.
Support the recommendation.
Paul Lewis.
Yes, I support the recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's that recommendation supported then. I've not got any items under either part 1 or part 2, so thank you all for joining us. It's been a bit different, but I think it, all things considered, worked rather well. If you've got another meeting now at Barry Town Council, enjoy, and if not, have a good evening, and we'll see you all again soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chair.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank
Before
you.
we go, is there anything else that needs to be done housekeeping-wise?
No, thank you very much, Chair. You've gone through the recommendations, so that's all we need for the minutes. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. I'll sign off then. All of you, see you soon. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.